Okay, the last work before the launch is Phoenix. Hugo from Concordia University are going to talk about how can we survive even if our bug are not patched using accurate and efficient filtering of system call sequences. So please, Hugo.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hu. I don't know if you can hear me correctly. That sounds correct. Yeah, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to present today. My name is Hugo. I'm from Concordia University of Montreal. And today I want to present you our latest work, Phoenix. It's about how to survive unpatched vulnerabilities via accurate and efficient filtering of Syscall sequences. The current approach to security patching is kind of the following. By the way, no offense to Microsoft here. I just took the first thing that came to my mind, if there are Microsoft people in the room. But when you have a vulnerable piece of software, usually you have to go to the vendor, except if the code is open source, but we know a lot of time it's not. And so there is a whole process in the company vulnerability assessment, investigation, and eventually you're going to get your actual piece of software, which is a patch, and then you need to apply that. So it's represented here as a cylinder. The problem is that most of the time it takes a lot of time. There was a study that shows that it can take up to 100 days for actually developing a patch for 0 days. And so obviously it's a problem. In December 2021, after the Log4Shell vulnerability has been disclosed, some Canadian government website had to shut down because they just were not able to patch the vulnerability on time. And so in response to that, we wanted to develop Phoenix with, as a new approach to security patching. So Phoenix is two things. First, it's a new approach. We would like to get the users involved in the security patching process instead of simply relying on the vendor. And through that, we can use crowdsourcing. That crowdsourcing, and I'm going to detail how it goes later on, but obviously we can't generate an actual patch for the software, but instead we're trying to get a piece of information that can represent the vulnerability we are trying to fix, and that's represented by a circle here. It's much easier to get than an actual patch. It's just information about the vulnerability, and for instance, it can take the form of a sequence of system calls that the vulnerability has to go through to be triggered. And Phoenix is not only that, but Phoenix is also an actual tool. With that piece of information in hand, we want to provide a way to be able to apply that temporary patching using the piece of information we obtained, and that way you can prevent the vulnerability from being exploited. So of course this is a temporary patch, but at least you are protected. And we wanted to have that approach as universal. It means in the future, if you get some other vulnerabilities, then again you can go through the same process and you can use Phoenix again to apply the new pieces of patch to your program. So that's kind of like trying to find one way to patch them all using just one tool instead of having to rely on multiple vulnerability patches. We inspire from two main branches of some active research branches. The first one is forensics analysis and attack detection. There is some great tools in both the academy and the industry that allow, for instance, to generate some provenance graphs that are really useful when you work with system exploits. And you also have some provenance graph analysis tools. The limitation, they are great, but they have some limitation, which is sometimes you will have to do some manual inspection. If you just have the provenance graph, you have to rely on either someone, and it can take a lot of time, or, and the most important thing is that these might help you understand what happened and where the vulnerability is, but it won't provide you with an actual fix. It means you know what happened, but you still have a vulnerable piece of software. On the other hand, we have some application hardening tools. So again, industry and academia came up with some great tools, mostly regarding to system call filtering here. So most of these approaches, they rely on Seccomp filters because they are really efficient. And the problem with this is that most of the time you can just block one or multiple system calls at a time without really considering if it's part of a sequence or not. And that's because Seccomp, the Seccomp filters that are really used in containers, for instance, this is stateless. Seccomp doesn't remember what it's seen in the past. On the other hand, you can also use Ptrace, which has been here for quite some time, and it's really good, but it's really inefficient. And we're going to see that later on. So when we designed Phoenix, we really wanted to bridge that gap. When you have a vulnerable piece of software, we want to be able to dig to the root cause, what's the root cause, and actually fix it. And that's how we came up with Phoenix. You might not be familiar with this picture. This is Montreal airport border control area. If you ever go to Montreal, which I recommend because it's really nice, except it's really cold right now. But this is how it looks. The reason I'm showing you that is not to invite you to come to Montreal, although it's great. It's because when you pass the border at the airport, there is really two different speeds. If you, for instance, here, if you come from Canada and USA, most likely someone is just going to check your passport and it's going to be really quick. And it's not really secure because, you know, it's just a passport. But on the other hand, if you come from another part of the world, they might take you to a back room and ask you a lot of questions. I'm French, and when I came the first time, they asked me if I had some cheese in my luggages because in some states it's forbidden. And so this is a much more secure process, but it can take a lot of time. I spent like a few hours waiting there at the airport. And that's really something we're going to see when I'm going to expose our key IDs. We have some limitation in existing solutions. The first one, the solution that uses Seccomp to block some system calls. The first approach you can do is like, okay, I'm going to block system calls that my vulnerable program does not need. And at least it can restrict it can reduce the attack surface. But the problem is that you're going to have some issues because if your exploits use the same system call as your application, then you can't block them. Otherwise, your container is not going to be able to run. And so you're going to have some issues here. The container is going to remain vulnerable. The second approach you can do is say, okay, now instead I'm going to block the system call. I'm going to decide to block them no matter what. And then you might again have some issues because Seccomp cannot do deep argument in inspection, and it also doesn't have any concept of sequences. And so you're going to have some false positive here. It's pretty inaccurate, and you're going to end up blocking some system calls that the program needs, which is obviously a problem. Last approach you can use is Ptrace. So it's both secure and accurate, and that's actually the officer asking you a lot of questions at the border. You can inspect every single system call and make sure that it's the right argument and it's in the right sequence, but it's going to take a lot of time. Ptrace has to stop on every single system call to do that. And the program is going to suffer prohibitive delay. Now, when we designed Phoenix, we really wanted to have these three things: security, accuracy, efficiency. The way we do that is that we're going to have, for every system call that comes, we're going to have a first filter using Seccomp. So we call it Seccomp pre-filtering. We're just asking the system call, what's your name? Who are you? That way, any system call that we are not interested in, for instance, if it's not in the sequence yet, we're just going to let them go, and it's very efficient. Now, if it's the actual system call I'm looking for, then only I'm going to trigger Ptrace in order to perform deep argument inspection, for instance. And this way, I can also let go the system calls that I know are not actually the ones I'm looking for, and I can instead enforce some security action on the system call I want. Now, you might see that when I do that, I still cannot block sequences because the Seccomp filter doesn't actually update itself, but that's what we actually do. That's the key idea here. After we observe the first system call in the sequence, we're going to update the Seccomp filter in order to monitor the second system call in the sequence, and so on. And that way, we keep security, accuracy, and efficiency. All right, so quickly the methodology. We have two phases here. So when you have a vulnerable piece of software, the first thing we are going to do with Phoenix, we collect the system audit logs in order to build a provenance graph. A system provenance graph, and then we can receive some alerts. For instance, Falco is really used in the industry. Using this provenance graph and the corresponding alert, we are able, through root cause analysis, to extract the actual malicious sequence of system call that we want to block. So that step, we call it malicious sequence identification. Once we have that, we're actually going to have a few steps to do, like to build a second state machine from that sequence. And then we have our combination of Seccomp and Ptrace in order to monitor the state of the sequence and eventually apply some security actions on the system calls. You might want to allow the first system call in the sequence and block the last one, just to be safe. We call that dynamic runtime protection, and that way we can allow the legitimate system calls and block the malicious ones. The first approach is the one that we would like to see done as crowdsourcing, and the second one can be actually applied by every affected user. For the malicious sequence identification, we start from a provenance graph. There is very good tools to generate them, system provenance graph. And for instance, this is an example of the provenance graph that is, we extract the attack subgraph from that provenance graph. This is an example following the dirty pipe vulnerability. And using that, we can actually map back the system calls that were used during the exploit and obtain a list, a sequence of these system calls with the corresponding PIDs, argument, and return code if we need them. And then during the dynamic runtime protection, the first thing we need to do, we need to actually define our first Seccomp filter. So in that case, I want to block the sequence open pipe. I want to monitor that. The first thing I'm going to do is set up my Seccomp filter to look for the open system call and only for the open system call, because that's the first one. This way, any other system call is just going to go through really efficiently, no checks here. But when the actual open system call comes, then I'm going to trigger Ptrace, verify if it's the one that I'm actually looking for. In case of a match, I'm going to update my Seccomp filter to look for the second system call, which is pipe. And doing that, I can let go of the first system call, and every other system call, like select, load, write, they're just going to go through efficiently. And when I observe the second one, I can again trigger Ptrace and decide to take some action or not. For instance, in that case, I know this is part of the attack, and I would like to block that. Quickly, because I don't want to stand too long between you and your lunch, but in terms of implementation, we have some first few steps to build the actual final state machine, and then we're going to apply our Seccomp filter to every process that we want to monitor. Then we're going to trace the processes using Ptrace. We still use Ptrace, but this time we're going to use the trace Seccomp flag, which only stops Ptrace when it received a trigger from one of the Seccomp filters. And using that, we can actually return the actual state of the system call. So system call arguments, we can return that when the system call actually happens, and we can do some matching. If in case of a match, to update the Seccomp filter, we use a kernel module. We need to do two things. We need to compile the new Seccomp filter with the new system call, and we need to actually apply that Seccomp filter to the existing filters. To do that, we have to go into the task structure of the kernel and actually modify the pointer that points to the Berkeley packet filter. So that's basically how it's done. Once it's done, we can actually decide to take a security action depending on where we stand in the sequence. Again, if I'm at the beginning, I might want to allow the system calls or send a warning. Or if I'm later, I might want to actually block it. In terms of experiments, so security-wise, we applied Phoenix and some others security tools, 3 of them actually, and we found out that because Phoenix can actually consider sequences instead of static system calls, we can block most of the time more vulnerabilities. Again, because we can consider sequences instead of single system calls. On the other hand, when we actually work, because Phoenix is kind of a blacklisting approach, so there are existing tools that also takes into account the context of system calls, sequences and stuff, but most of the time they are for whitelisting approaches, anomaly detection. And these tools, unfortunately, they kind of have issues when the attacker tries to change slightly the sequence of system call. And Phoenix is about to actually catch them without false positives. In terms of performances, because that's an important point, well, the thing is that Phoenix only works when you observe the system call. And in the sense that we always have a Seccomp filter running, but Seccomp filters, they run in the kernel, and this is close to native speed. We see almost no overhead here, and we only call Ptrace when we actually really need to. And so that way we have almost no overhead compared to Ptrace, which can sometimes take like twice as much in terms of response time. And even when we employ deep argument inspection with Phoenix. And that is also reflected in terms of CPU. Ptrace needs to constantly use, for instance, here 5% of the CPU, but Phoenix only uses CPU when it actually needs to, which makes our approach very efficient. Finally, in terms of actually investigating the attack, so we did some experiment with 5 of the 5 most common CVs that we worked with. We used some different tools to actually extract some sequence of system calls and found out that usually Phoenix really helps to identify meaningful sequences of system call without too much false positive or false negative. So it works pretty well here. And on the other side, we asked some users to actually do some investigations based on a provenance graph as big as 200,000 nodes. And we found out that they usually, in less than half an hour, they're able to identify the actual attack subgraph. So we believe that that approach could be used in the future. To summarize, so we designed Phoenix to prevent the exploit of unpatched vulnerabilities. So again, this is a temporary patch. It's not meant to be actual long-term, but at least it helps while you wait for an official vendor patch. We are able to accurately and efficiently block some sequence of system calls by combining Seccomp and Ptrace. To extract our sequence of system calls, we went in the direction of provenance analysis. And finally, we evaluated our tool on some real-world CVs, and we found out that we obtained negligible or delay and pretty high efficiency. Thank you so much for listening. I'll take any question.
Thank you. Very nice talk, and I really like how you combine these different approaches to get good performance out of it. Your signatures that you're creating seem like they're very specific to either a proof of concept or an exploit in the wild. And it seems like it may get very fragile. And it's reminding me of problems of mimicry attacks when we started using system call sequences to detect malicious behavior 20 plus years ago. Have you thought about how an attacker might kind of work beyond the state machines that you're using as signatures?
Yes, that's a good question. So yeah, I believe you're mentioning two, for instance, mimicry attacks. Mimicry attacks are actually a problem. It consists of when you're trying to slightly change the behavior of an exploit in order to avoid detection. So yeah, obviously that's been a problem in our case also, but it's been a problem for a very long time. So we have a step in our approach that is kind of trying to do sequence abstraction, in the sense we are trying to only get the most important system calls that are really part of the vulnerability and that the attacker cannot really avoid. And but eventually, I believe finite state machines are limited for that. So we are actually thinking about using some new approaches that we know work better, machine learning based approaches. The only issue is this, that they can take quite a lot of time at inference. So at least final state machine is really fast, and we need to get an answer really quick, because we're actually holding the system calls while we do checks. But eventually, yeah, I agree, machine learning approaches can really help to overcome mimicry attacks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm Asabat from the University of Twente. One question regarding Falco alerts. So do you use that as an input to your provenance graph?
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So in that particular work, yeah, we decided to go with Falco and provenance graph. Now we have some ongoing works to include more inputs. It can be Falco alerts, but it can also be simply some user input as well.
Yeah, on that, so do you use your own rule set for Falco, or do you base your, let's say, logic on the default rule set?
So in that particular case, we use the default rule set because we realize that most of the time it works. Something we noticed is that sometimes you're gonna get an alert not for the exploitation of the vulnerability itself, but for its effect. Like for instance, you might have a CV exploit that allows a user to eventually become root. And most of the time we get the alert to become root. And so using actually root cause analysis, we can backpropagate and backtrace to the actual vulnerabilities. So yeah, we use Falco alerts only as to get the entry point in the provenance graph, but eventually we have to go back and backtrace that, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have one more question.
Hi, Roland Yap, NUS. My memory of BPF filters is a bit hazy, but it's a program. Like, so why do you say that it cannot do a sequence? And I think you can have state in a BPF. So for example, there's associative maps and stuff like that, I think.
So as far as we are concerned, when you apply a Seccomp filter, so yes, you are right. In reality, it's going to be a Berkeley packet filter that's running in the kernel. As far as we checked, Seccomp is actually stateless. So when you use the regular BPF, you actually can't store anything. You can't remember what you've seen in the past.
But there are associative maps. I think there are associative maps you can use. So there are some kind of data.
So I mean, there is something that's called eBPF, and that's much more recent. And these things actually are stateful.
Right. Sorry, right? I mean eBPF. Yes.
Oh, sorry. So yeah, actually, very good point. I was actually anticipating that question here. So yeah, our next work is probably include eBPF as well. For now, Seccomp is based on BPF only, and so it's stateless. But eBPF would be a really good way to actually do the same idea, maybe for the future. Yes.
In a much bigger programs also.
Yes, you have more capabilities here when you use eBPF. The reason we went for Seccomp, to be honest, is because Seccomp is actually used for Docker containers and most of the containers, and that's actually our biggest use case. I think there was a discussion in the kernel about integrating eBPF to Seccomp filters, but for now it's not done yet. The maintainer of Seccomp was not really on to the.
Why isn't it trivial?
Sorry, what was that?
Why isn't it trivial? But never mind, that's a separate. It's not your stuff.
I don't know exactly why they do.
Another question is kind of follow up to the mimicry attack question. So it wasn't quite clear when you say sequence what you mean. So are you saying that you have a state machine and you want to check the state machine against the sequence of system calls so far? Is that what you mean? So
exactly, yeah. I'm actually, I know I have a particular sequence of system calls I would like to block, because I know this sequence of system call represents the attack. And so, yeah, I build a state machine in order to monitor for that sequence in particular and trying to block that. Yeah.
Right. So the mimicry attack would be the attacker would want to find a sequence which is used by the program, but he can repurpose it for his thing, and then you will not be able to block that.
Exactly, yes. So yeah, before that we had the problem, if your syscall is the same as the attacker syscall, you have a problem, and most of the time that's the case. But yeah, now we have another problem, that is if your sequence of system call is the same as the attacker's sequence of system call. So this is still a problem, but at least it's a much smaller problem. Now we restricted the attack surface even more. Yeah.
Okay. And then, so one small point is that because you have a state machine, it might be possible to do DOS attacks on the state machine. So I forgot the name of this kind of attack. But there are a whole bunch of DOS attacks on state machines or regex.
So this is true, yeah.
And can be pretty bad. But it's a DOS only.
Yeah, exactly. So it can be pretty bad, and in reality, no matter if you use Ptrace or Phoenix, yeah, DOS is always going to be a problem. Yeah. So yeah. Yeah, so yeah, it can eventually become a problem, yeah. But again, DOS is not really in our scope. We believe DOS attacks are always going to be a problem here, yeah.
But it attacks your apps, it doesn't attack the program.
Yeah, no, I understand, I understand.
It's not even be exploitation, it only attacks the
So yeah, actually, yeah, it's a use case we plan to investigate when we move to ABPF. Maybe we will have some better ways to protect against that. Yeah.
Okay, I think we can thank Hugo again for the Phoenix work.